All right, let's talk about something fascinating and honestly pretty misunderstood: neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP. But we're not going to do the usual textbook definition. No, we're going to dig deeper and find out what was really going on at its core. Think of it like this: it's a story about people who were amazing at spotting patterns, but they were totally missing the blueprint.
So when I say NLP, what pops into your head? For a lot of people, it's, a toolbox of communication tricks, right? Or maybe a way to build rapport, some techniques for self-improvement. And look, it can be all those things, but that's just scratching the surface. That's only the top layer of a much, much deeper story.
And here's the big idea for today, the lens we're going to look through. Let's reframe NLP. It's not just a collection of tools. It was actually a pioneering, really systematic attempt to map the stable patterns in how we think. But, and this is the kicker, they were mapping this incredible territory without a clue about the underlying geology, the deep foundational structures that actually created the landscape in the first place.
Okay, so let's throw out that toolbox metaphor for a minute and see what was really going on back when NLP first hit the scene.
Yeah, so you see all these common labels: a toolbox, a persuasion model, a coaching framework. And again, none of these are exactly wrong, they're just incomplete. It's like looking at a high-performance car and just calling it a metal box with wheels. I mean, sure, but you're completely missing the engine, the transmission, the whole complex system that actually makes the thing go. And this is a really critical point to get. The founders of NLP, they weren't sitting in some sterile lab cooking up theories. No way. They were out in the wild, just observing. They'd find people who were absolutely brilliant at what they did, and they'd ask this one simple, powerful question: what is it that you're doing consistently that just works? It was all about empirical discovery, seeing what was actually happening.
And that brings us to the real genius of early NLP. When you boil it all down, it was this incredible art form, an art of recognizing and then codifying the patterns of human excellence. The entire field, literally the whole thing, was built on this one core idea: modeling. And what that meant was finding someone who was an absolute master, a world-class therapist, an amazing leader, a super persuasive communicator, and just deconstructing everything they did, breaking it down into repeatable, transferable patterns. And what's crazy is they saw this stuff everywhere they looked. It became clear that excellence wasn't just some random fluke. The top performers, they had these repeatable sequences, these very specific behaviors, these internal strategies that produced predictable, amazing results again and again. They were literally finding order in the chaos of human behavior.
And this was the revolutionary idea that fueled the entire movement. The core assumption was, if you can identify a pattern, you can transfer it, you can teach it to someone else. They truly believed that excellence wasn't just some innate talent you were born with, it was a skill that could be learned. And you know what? They were right, mostly. This is where the story starts to get a little more complicated.
Why complicated? Because for every stunning success story, there were also failures. Sometimes you could transfer a pattern and it would work like a charm. Other times, it would just completely fall flat. So what gives? The reason is that NLP was fantastic at identifying the patterns on the surface, but it didn't see the invisible architecture underneath that was making it all possible. I mean, think about it. Patterns aren't random. That sounds super obvious, right? But it's actually a really profound point. The fact that patterns exist at all implies that there's some kind of underlying order. There's a reason they show up.
And that is the missing piece of the puzzle. It's called cognitive architecture. See, all those patterns NLP was so good at discovering, they're just the surface expressions of this much deeper system. I love this analogy. Think of NLP as mapping the landscape: the rivers, the mountains, the valleys. But structural cognition, that's the geology. It's the tectonic plates, the bedrock, the deep forces that shaped the landscape in the first place.
And this architecture, it's not random either. It has rules, it has principles. We're talking about things like cognitive load. That's basically how much information your brain is juggling. Or topology, which is just the shape of your mental pathways. And coherence, how well your thoughts are lining up. These aren't just fuzzy, abstract ideas. This is like the physics of the mind. And these principles, they are the reason the NLP patterns exist at all.
Okay, theory is cool, but let's make this practical. How does looking through this new architectural lens totally change how we see the classic NLP techniques? Let's take a look.
Let's start with a classic: anchoring. Linking a touch or a sound to a specific feeling. The old way of thinking was just, oh, it's a psychological association. Simple. But the structural view, it's way more precise.
It sees anchoring as a controlled placement of cognitive load into a specific mental pathway. And this explains perfectly why anchoring sometimes just doesn't work. If that pathway is already jammed or the whole system is overloaded, it doesn't matter how perfectly you set the anchor. It's just not going to fire. Or how about state? We talk about changing our state all the time, right? Going from feeling down to feeling confident. But what is a state? Structurally, it's not just a mood. It's a snapshot of the entire system's configuration at that moment. It's all about how load is distributed, how coherent everything is. It's a full-on architectural event. And that's why our states can sometimes shift so incredibly fast.
And then there's reframing. It's so easy to think of it as just a clever word trick, but it's so much more than that. The language is just the delivery truck. What's it carrying? Structural load. A really great reframe delivers that load in just the right way to help the entire architecture of someone's identity reorganize itself into something more stable, more resourceful. It's not the words that are magic. It's the structural shift they cause.
This right here explains that old practitioner paradox. Why some NLP folks were absolute wizards getting incredible results, while others followed the same script and got nothing. The masters, the wizards, they weren't just following a recipe. They were intuitively reading the cognitive architecture of the person they were with. They could feel the topology, sense the load, and they'd adjust what they were doing on the fly. So what's the big takeaway here? It means we can finally move NLP from being this amazing art of pattern recognition to a real science of cognitive mechanics. Because without that model of architecture, NLP was always going to be limited. It couldn't really explain why a technique failed. It couldn't predict where its limits were. And it couldn't guarantee that a good change would actually stick around. It was incredibly powerful, for sure, but it was also incomplete. Now, this is super important. This new understanding doesn't throw NLP out the window. Not at all. In fact, it does the opposite. It gives it the solid, scientific foundation it was always missing. It finally explains the why behind the what. It takes NLP from this cool collection of observations and elevates it into a truly grounded discipline. And that, I think, is the true legacy of NLP. It was this absolutely critical bridge in history. It took the gut feelings and intuition of brilliant people and turned it all into observable, repeatable models. It proved that genius wasn't just magic. It was a structure you could identify and maybe, just maybe, transfer. What a massive step forward for understanding how we work. So, to wrap it all up, the NLP pioneers were absolutely onto something real. They knew, they could feel that there was a deep structure to how we experience the world. And they did a frankly brilliant job of mapping out its surface features. They pointed us in the right direction. And that leaves us with one last question to chew on. If the patterns NLP found were really just the symptoms of a much deeper cognitive architecture, what other fields out there are doing the same thing? Think about it. Economics, leadership, even coaching. How many of them are just describing the surface patterns, totally waiting for someone to come along and discover the fundamental architecture that's driving the whole show? Something to think about. Thanks for joining.